The fog never quite lifts in Millgrave Hollow. It hangs like a hush over the valley, curling through the branches of sleeping oaks, settling into the cracks of cobblestone paths, and softening the lantern lights that flicker each evening without fail. Some say the mist has a scent lavender, faint and haunting. Not the sweet kind found in bath soaps or kitchen drawers, but something older, earthy, like dried flowers tucked into a letter that was never sent. Eleanor felt it that night. She always did when she passed the Weatherford House. It stood just past the edge of the village, where the gravel turned to moss and even birds grew quiet. The house wasn't exactly abandoned, its shutters didn't creak, its roof hadn't caved, but no one had lived in it for nearly 40 years. Not since the incident. Everyone knew the story, of course. A wedding that never happened. A man named Jonas Weatherford, who vanished on the eve of his vows. A bride in lavender lace left waiting at the altar, her heart said to have burst from grief. But stories warp in time. Eleanor had never cared for gossip until she began smelling lavender every time she passed by, even when the air was heavy with coming rain. She didn't tell anyone. What was there to say? A scent in the mist? People would call it imagination. Eleanor preferred to keep such things to herself. She walked the same path every evening after supper. It kept her grounded 3 turns past the bakery, over the bridge, past the hollow where the Weatherford House loomed in a silence that felt attentive. Tonight something shifted. The fog was thicker. Her boots disappeared into it, making her feel like she was walking into memory. And the lavender stronger than ever. Not cloying, just present. As if someone had walked ahead of her, trailing it like perfume. She paused at the iron gate. It wasn't locked. It never had been. She had touched it before, curious. But tonight, her hand didn't reach for it. Instead, the gate creaked open by itself. Not wide, just enough. She didn't intend to step through. But her feet didn't seem to need her mind's permission. The garden inside hadn't grown wild, like one would expect. The grass was short, the hedges round. The lavender bushes, yes, real ones, lined the walkway in full bloom, even though it was far too late in the season. Something rustled softly. Not wind, not animals. More like silk brushing against stone. Her breath caught. She turned. No one. But then, just ahead by the porch, a figure. A woman, back turned, head slightly tilted. Her hair was swept into a vintage chignon. The lavender gown clung to her like time hadn't touched it. Eleanor couldn't move. Not out of fear, out of stillness, like the moment deserved not to be broken. Then the woman turned slowly, her face veiled in the mist, not blurred, just unreachable. And she smiled, not sad, not vengeful, just tired. Eleanor blinked, and the woman was gone, but the scent lingered, warm as a sigh. She found herself at the gate again, not quite remembering how she'd stepped back through it. The village lights were glowing down the path. The fog had softened, and the air felt lighter. But her fingertips still tingled, and in her coat pocket, something crinkled. A pressed sprig of lavender. The sprig of lavender lay on Eleanor's knitstand, wrapped in a folded tissue she didn't remember placing there. She hadn't told anyone, not Mrs. Langley from the bakery who asked after her walk that morning, Not old Mr. Hargrove, who eyed her oddly from his porch swing as she passed. It would be easy to pretend nothing had happened, but the scent clung to her coat, her hair, even her pillow. Not perfume, this was deeper, almost like memory. Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed, brushing her fingertips over the soft purple buds. A gentle crackle came from the tissue, and for a moment she thought she heard something else, faint music. A waltz, maybe, carried from far away. She stood quickly. It stopped. She hadn't slept well. Her dreams were strange. Not frightening, but vivid. The woman in the lavender dress stood in a garden at dusk, humming a tune Eleanor didn't recognize. She held out her hand like she was waiting for a dance partner who never arrived. At breakfast, Eleanor picked at her toast. The morning fog hadn't lifted. It rarely did in Millgrave Hollow, but today it seemed heavier, as if the mist had grown thicker from within. She resolved to go to the Weatherford House again, not out of curiosity this time, but a sense of unfinished something, a weight she couldn't name pressing softly at the edges of her mind. The house didn't look different in daylight, though it seemed less inclined to hide behind shadows. Its windows were clouded with age, its porch still steady beneath the weight of invisible memory. Eleanor pushed the gate. It opened without resistance. The garden welcomed her in silence. The same lavender bushes swayed gently, though there was no breeze. And then she heard it. Music. Faint but unmistakable. A waltz the same as in her dream. It seemed to come from the house, or perhaps from the garden itself. She followed it, her steps light over the stone path, until she stood once more on the porch. The front door, once locked tight, was now ajar. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and lavender. She stepped in. The air felt thick, like stepping underwater. Dust floated in sunbeams that filtered through lace curtains. Everything was intact, the furniture, the framed photographs, a crystal decanter half filled with something amber. She wandered slowly, careful not to disturb anything. In the parlor, the record player sat quietly in the corner, and yet the music continued, though no record turned. She approached the mantel. Above it hung a photograph of a couple, a young man in a formal suit, a woman in a lavender dress. They looked impossibly elegant. The woman's eyes were gentle, but distant. The man beside her, Jonas Weatherford, Eleanor assumed, wore an expression that suggested he had secrets. She reached out to straighten the frame, but her fingers met cold air and stopped. A sudden image flickered behind her eyes, Jonas, standing at the edge of the garden, looking back at the house, as though deciding something impossible. Then a voice, soft, feminine, almost breathless. He promised he'd come back. Eleanor turned. No one. Only the scent growing stronger. She backed away slowly, heart steady, but aware of something stirring just out of sight. As she stepped outside again, the music faded. The door behind her closed with a quiet click, and in her coat pocket she felt another weight. A hairpin, ornate, silver with a single amethyst stone. Later that night, she placed it beside the lavender on her knitstand. The music returned, faint as a lullaby. She didn't sleep deeply, but the dreams came just the same. In them, the woman stood by the garden's edge again, only this time she turned toward Eleanor and said, "Would you listen if I told you?" Eleanor nodded, and the garden began to bloom. The next morning the fog was thinner, as if something in the air had shifted. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, staring at the silver hairpin. It gleamed faintly in the morning light, the amethyst catching a purple hue that echoed the sprig of lavender beside it. She hadn't dreamt the night before, not in the usual sense. It had felt more like being shown something. A memory, perhaps. One not her own. In it, she had seen the woman again. Not ghostly, not tragic, but alive. Laughing in the garden, arranging flowers for her wedding day. Jonas had stood beside her, his hands covered in soil as he tried and failed to plant a rosebush. Their voices had been clear, warm, real. Eleanor touched the hairpin. It was cold now, but no less present. Later, she walked to the local library. Millgrave Hollow had few visitors, and even fewer residents who bothered with its dusty shelves, but Eleanor knew where to look. Mrs. Peterman, the librarian, looked up and gave her a small nod. "Looking for something in particular, dear? Do you have anything on the Weatherford family?" Mrs. Peterman didn't ask why. She simply led her to the back room where old bound newspapers and village registries sat in silence. Hours passed. Eleanor sifted through yellowed clippings, brittle headlines, fading photographs. The official story was what people remembered. Jonas Weatherford disappeared the night before his wedding to Lydia Marin, his childhood sweetheart. The last anyone saw of him was at the train depot. A witness claimed he looked pale, anxious, and left without his luggage. Lydia, it was said, refused to believe he had run away. She kept the house waiting for him, dressing each morning as if the wedding were still to come. She died exactly 1 year later. Heart failure, the obituary read. She was 27, but one article, buried and nearly illegible, caught Eleanor's eye. Suspicious activity near Weatherford Estate. It mentioned voices heard late at night. Unexplained lights in the garden. A neighbor reported seeing a man in a dark coat near the greenhouse days after Jonas's disappearance. And then something strange. A list of Lydia's belongings recovered after her death. A lavender dress, a pearl comb, and one silver hairpin with an amethyst stone. Eleanor's fingers froze on the page. It was the same one. She left the library quietly, the weight of the story curling around her like the evening mist. That night she didn't plan to return to the Weatherford house. But as she stood by her window, she saw something. Light. Soft and golden. Not a lantern, not a trick of fog. It came from the upstairs bedroom, the one above the parlor. Something was calling. Not demanding. Just waiting. Eleanor put on her coat. The hairpin in her pocket pulsed warm against her hand. The walk to the house felt different. The mist didn't obscure, if anything, it cleared a path. The gate opened before she touched it. The lavender bushes bowed slightly, as if acknowledging her return. She stepped through the front door. The music was back, slower this time. The record player still sat idle, yet the melody floated clearly. Upstairs, the door to the bedroom stood open. Inside, the scent was strongest. Not overwhelming welcoming. A veil of lavender, old wood, and something like candle wax. On the vanity sat a letter. The paper was soft with age, folded carefully. The ink faded. She unfolded it. "My dearest Lydia, I thought I could leave, thought I could forget the weight of my family's debt, and the shame it brings. But I couldn't tell you. I didn't want you to carry it, too. I thought disappearing would spare you. But I see now, I only left you alone. I never stopped loving you. Forgive me." Eleanor's breath caught. Behind her, the curtains fluttered, though the windows were shut. A soft light bloomed near the vanity mirror. Not a reflection, an image. Lydia, sitting at the vanity, holding the letter, her face calm. She didn't cry. She simply smiled, folded the paper, and tucked it gently into a drawer that no longer existed. Eleanor blinked. The light dimmed, but the room no longer felt haunted. It felt quiet, at peace. The following morning felt unusually still, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Eleanor woke with the sunlight on her pillow, the soft warmth cutting through the mist that usually lingered even indoors. She looked over at the neat stand. The lavender sprig was dry now, its color beginning to fade, but the hairpin still shimmered, and next to it, neatly folded, was the letter. She was certain she hadn't brought it home. That day passed slowly. She didn't speak to anyone, not because she was afraid, but because something delicate had begun to unravel inside her, threads of a story only she seemed to be witnessing. In the early evening, Eleanor returned to the Weatherford House. It no longer felt forbidden. If anything, the gate opening under her fingers felt like a sigh of welcome. She wandered through the garden, letting her fingertips brush the blooming lavender. There was something rhythmic about the air, as if it breathed with her. She found herself standing in front of the greenhouse. It had been overgrown with ivy the last time she looked, its windows smeared with decades of dust. But now the vines had drawn back slightly, enough for her to see inside. Something glinted. The door, once sealed with rust, gave way under her hand. The scent inside was stronger lavender, roses, and something bitter like dried herbs. The floor was covered in old leaves and cracked stone, but in the center stood a small bench. On it, a box, wooden, carved with initials, L.M. Eleanor sat. Her hands didn't tremble, though she felt the weight of years pressing through her palms as she opened the lid. Inside, a dried corsage, a strand of pearls, a ribbon stained at the edges with something she hoped was wine, and a photograph she hadn't seen before. Jonas and Lydia. Not posed this time. Laughing, her head thrown back, his hand resting on her knee. Behind them, the garden in bloom. The image stirred something quiet and aching. Under the photograph was another letter. This one was unsigned. The ink bled slightly, as if it had been written in haste. They say I ran, but I didn't. I was taken. There are debts a man like me can't pay with money. They wanted silence, and I gave it, thinking she'd move on. But I see now some promises don't end with breath. Eleanor exhaled slowly. As she folded the letter, the light inside the greenhouse changed. Warmer, as if the setting sun had finally reached in. She looked up and saw her again, Lydia. Not in the gown this time, but in a simple garden dress, her hands tucked gently in front of her. They locked eyes, and Lydia gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Eleanor didn't speak. She simply returned the photograph to the box, closed it carefully, and stood. The apparition faded, but not into nothing. It was more like mist turning to breath. That night, Eleanor placed the box on her windowsill. She didn't know why. only that it felt right. The moon rose full and soft, and from somewhere, not the house, not the village, but something in between, a voice came gently. "He didn't leave me. He was taken." Eleanor whispered into the stillness, "I believe you." And for the first time in many nights, she fell asleep before the clock struck 10, the lavender scent still lingering like a memory that no longer hurt. By the end of the week, Eleanor noticed something strange about the village. Not haunting, not eerie, just different. The bakery's bell rang softer, as if muffled by more than just fog. The birds that usually sang from the church spire kept quieter, as if listening for something. And more curious still, the people of Millgrave Hollow had begun to mention the Weatherford House again. Not in whispers or warnings, but as if it had re-entered the present tense. Mr. Hargrove muttered something about seeing the garden trimmed. Mrs. Langley mentioned lavender blooming out of season. Eleanor said nothing. She wasn't ready to share, not yet. Some stories need to ripen in solitude. But she did return each evening at the same hour. Never rushed. Always walking slowly past the old iron gate that now greeted her like an old friend. One evening, as she sat in the garden with a box on her lap, she noticed something new. A trail of small stones arranged carefully near the base of the old oak. It hadn't been there before. She followed it. It curved around the back of the house, leading to a part of the property she hadn't explored, an old servant's cottage, half swallowed by ivy and shadow. The door was crooked, but not locked. Inside, dust motes danced in the slanting light. Time had moved through this place gently. A chair rested in the corner, a broken clock, and above the fireplace, something scrawled into the wood. He took the key. She kept the vow. Eleanor ran her hand over the words. They felt old yet fresh, like they'd been waiting. On the table sat a leather-bound journal, thin, faded, but clearly placed. She opened it. The handwriting was different from Jonas's, more ornate with flourishes. Lydia's, perhaps. June 4th. Still no word. The lilia are wilting. He never liked Lily. June 11th. The neighbors look at me like I've gone mad. Maybe I have. But what would they know of love so real it keeps the garden breathing? July 2. I heard him last night. His voice, not a dream. He said my name like it belonged to him still. Eleanor kept reading, page after page. The entries grew fragmented. Fewer dates, more longing. Words crossed out, then rewritten. And finally, the last page. August 15th. The veil is thinner now. I see between things. I hear the spaces in silence. I am not waiting anymore. I am keeping watch. Eleanor closed the book. Her heart didn't race. It settled. She understood now. This wasn't a haunting. This was a promise that time hadn't broken. She left the cottage as the light dimmed. The lavender bushes glowed faintly in the dusk, as if illuminated from beneath. And on the porch of the Weatherford house stood Lydia, not watching, not weeping, just waiting. This time Eleanor walked straight toward her. No hesitation, no question. The figure didn't speak, but she offered something, a folded note. Eleanor opened it as the last rays of sun slipped behind the hills. It read, "If you hold memory gently, It will not fade. It will guide. It will rest with you. She looked up. Lydia was gone. But the fog felt warmer. The silence no longer lonely. The garden didn't whisper. It hummed. Eleanor began dreaming with her eyes open. Not in the way of sleepwalkers or poets, but with a quiet clarity that surprised even herself. In the mornings, when the mist pooled beneath the trees, she would brew her tea and sit by the window, watching as the fog moved like a great soft breath across the hills. The village continued on, unchanged in the way small towns always seem to be, but to Eleanor, the air shimmered with invisible threads. Whispers lingered at the corners of rooms. Shadows stayed just long enough to feel familiar. She no longer wondered if the veil had lifted. She knew it had. One afternoon she visited the village cemetery. Not out of fear, not out of grief, just curiosity. The kind that comes when something is unfinished, but close to becoming whole. She walked among the tilted stones until she found it. Lydia Marin Weatherford, 1879-1906. A simple headstone, weather-worn. Lavender bushes had grown wild around it, spilling over onto the path. Eleanor knelt and cleared some of the moss from the base. Someone had placed a small silver locket on the stone. She opened it. Inside, a portrait of Lydia, and next to it a scrap of handwritten paper folded tight. He never left. Not truly. And neither did I. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be one. That evening, Eleanor returned to the Weatherford House. The box still rested on the windowsill. She placed a locket beside the hairpin and the sprig of lavender, which had now turned pale and delicate like lace. She wandered through the house, no longer hesitating. She walked the upstairs hallway, her fingers brushing along the faded wallpaper. The place felt soft, like the worn pages of a beloved book. In the study, she found something new. An old phonograph with a fresh wax cylinder, loaded and ready. She didn't remember it being there before. When she cranked the handle and placed the needle, music played. Not just any song, the waltz. The same one that had haunted her dreams, filtered through memory and fog. But then something more. A voice. Low, gentle, male. Lydia, if somehow this reaches you, I'm sorry. I didn't run. I tried to protect you, but I never stopped loving you. I waited. I still wait. Eleanor froze. The voice was old, but sure. Not frightened, just aching. She closed her eyes and listened. Not for ghosts, but for truth. The house grew still. The fog outside thickened, then softened, pulling gently away from the window panes. And then, for the first time since Eleanor had begun walking these paths, she felt it an absence, a release, like something had finally let go. She stood by the window. The lavender outside bowed in unison with the wind. Behind her, a soft sound. 2 footsteps descending the stairs. She turned. No one there. Only the faint scent of lavender and the impression that the house at last was empty. But not alone. Eleanor walked outside, down the path, past the gate that now closed itself behind her with a gentle click. She didn't cry. She smiled, and as she looked back one last time, the front windows of the Weatherford house shimmered with a warmth like candlelight. A dance had ended, but the music remained. Rain came softly the next day, a hush of silver threads stitching the village into stillness. Millgrave Hollow always wore fog like a shawl, but rain was rarer, like a lullaby for the trees. Eleanor didn't mind. She watched it from her kitchen window, a cup of warm chamomile in hand, the scent of lavender still woven faintly into the walls. The house across the way, the Weatherford House, stood quiet now. No flickering lights, no footsteps in the hall, no music behind closed doors. But it no longer seemed forgotten. It breathed again in the way that stories do when they've been heard. Eleanor felt different, too, as though something inside her had been rearranged, not drastically, but meaningfully, like a room whose furniture had finally been placed in its proper shape. She spent the afternoon sorting through her own belongings, something she hadn't done in years. Tucked away in a small cedar box were pieces of her past old letters from her father, pressed petals from a Paris trip she barely remembered, and a locket of her own that she hadn't opened in decades. Inside, a photograph of herself at 19. Eyes wide, laughing at something someone just off camera had said. She couldn't remember what it was, but the warmth in her smile remained intact. She placed the locket beside Lydia's on the windowsill, 2 stories resting side by side. The fog had thinned by early evening, and for the first time in days the air carried a clarity that felt fresh. Eleanor walked the garden path with a sense of ease, her steps unburdened. As she approached the Weatherford house, she noticed something peculiar. The gate was gone. No hinges, no iron, not even a mark where it once stood. Just a clear path, uninterrupted. And in the lavender bush still blooming, impossibly so, sat a small envelope, sealed with wax the color of plum. She opened it slowly. The letter was written in Lydia's hand. You kept vigil when no one else did. You listened without asking, remembered without needing proof. That is how we cross over, not with noise, but with witness. Eleanor folded the letter gently and placed it in her coat pocket. The garden felt quieter now, but not empty. It felt completed. As she turned to leave, something drew her gaze to the upper window, Lydia's old room. No figure this time, no movement, just the curtain swaying gently. And then, without warning, the scent returned, not faint, not lingering, but full, alive. The air filled with lavender, fresh and heady and sweet, not sorrowful anymore. A scent of goodbye. Eleanor stood for a long while, letting it wash over her. The rain had stopped. The clouds parted, just enough to let the moon cast a pale glow over the hills. And there, under its light, she saw the garden had grown. Not just the lavender, but new blooms, white roses, foxglove, night jasmine. Flowers that hadn't been there before. Life returning, not just to the garden, to the story, to her. There's a kind of stillness that comes not from silence, but from resolution. That's what Eleanor felt in the days that followed. Not the absence of noise, but the presence of peace. She no longer felt the pull to return to the Weatherford house each evening. The fog still came and went as it always had. The lavender still bloomed unnaturally in the garden. But whatever had lingered in that house, unfinished, unspoken, had gently dissolved into rest. Still, Eleanor found herself walking past it. Not out of habit, but as one might visit a grave not to grieve, but to say thank you. One such evening, just as twilight folded the village into blue shadows, she noticed someone standing at the garden's edge. A girl no more than 10, with dark curls and rain boots 2 sizes too big. She was staring through the lavender with wide, unblinking eyes. Eleanor approached slowly. "You all right there, sweetheart?" The girl turned to her. "Does someone still live there?" Eleanor hesitated. "No one you can see?" The girl looked back at the house. "I heard music just now." Eleanor smiled gently. "You may have. Some songs take longer to stop playing." The girl tilted her head. Was it a happy house? That gave Eleanor pause. She looked at the window's curtains still drawn, porch untouched, and thought of Lydia and Jonas. "No," she said softly, "but it tried to be." The girl nodded, then ran off, splashing through the puddles without a backward glance. Eleanor watched until she disappeared down the road. Later that night, Eleanor sat at her writing desk. The journal Lydia had kept once hidden in the gardener's cottage now lay open in front of her, not as a curiosity, but as something sacred. She had begun transcribing it by hand, not to share widely, but to preserve it. The story deserved roots. As she wrote, the words flowed easily. Lydia's longing, her quiet defiance, her gentle madness, they came alive again through Eleanor's careful script. But this time they didn't ache. They sang. When she reached the final entry, she paused. Lydia had written, "I no longer wait for him to return. I simply wait for him to be remembered." Eleanor picked up her pen and just beneath it added her own words. "She is." Outside, the wind carried a soft rustle through the trees. Not enough to stir the lavender, but just enough to lift a single page on her desk. Eleanor didn't stop it. She let the page drift to the floor like a petal. She didn't need to finish the journal tonight. Some stories breathe better when they're allowed to rest between pages. That night, the dreams came again, but not of Lydia, not of Jonas. This time, Eleanor stood in the garden under a starless sky. 100 flowers bloomed around her in silence, and somewhere far off, the waltz began to play once more, not mournfully, but as an invitation. She didn't dance. She didn't move. She simply listened, and the garden pulsed with something older than sorrow. The waltz stayed with her long after she woke, not as a sound, but as a rhythm. Eleanor moved through the house in time with it boiling water, folding laundry, feeding the neighbor's cat, while Mrs. Langley recovered from a twisted ankle. Her movements were small, quiet, deliberate, and all the while the lavender scent remained, no longer clinging like memory, but resting like something that had found its place. She had expected the story to end. Instead, it had softened. One afternoon, while browsing the bookshop near the edge of town, a narrow, cluttered space run by a man who never spoke unless you asked him twice, Eleanor came across a collection of local folklore. She hadn't looked for it. It nearly fell into her hands, dislodged by a wobble in the shelf. Inside, yellowed pages told the usual tales. Ghosts in the mines, a woman in white near the old quarry, a horse that returned each year to the place it drowned. But tucked near the back, in an unlabeled chapter, she found something she hadn't seen before. The Bride Who Waited in Lavender. It was short, barely a page. It told of a young woman left alone, a man lost to debts, a house that refused to decay. It spoke of music in the fog and gardens that bloomed long after the frost. But what struck Eleanor was the last line. It is said that when the veil is thin and the air sweet with bloom, she walks again, not to search, but to remember. No author, no date, just a story. She bought the book, though the shopkeeper didn't charge her. "It's been waiting a while," he said with a shrug. Back home, she placed it beside Lydia's journal. A new chapter added to an old story. That evening, she received a letter. No stamp, no return address. Just her name, handwritten in a careful, looping script. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, aged but firm. For every tale you witness, another waits beneath it. You are not just hearing the past, you are tending it. Thank you. It wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. She placed it gently inside the journal's cover and went to the window. The Weatherford House stood still, shrouded in soft mist. The garden, glowing faintly in twilight, seemed untouched by time. And then, just briefly, she saw them. Two figures walking arm in arm along the lavender path. No drama, no farewell, just a slow walk, as if through memory itself. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. Eleanor placed her hand over her heart, not out of sorrow, out of recognition. Some things, once healed, don't leave a scar. They leave a garden. Spring came early to Millgrave Hollow. The frost receded gently, like a guest who knew when to leave, and buds appeared where winter had once laid claim. Eleanor took to walking the village with a small notebook in hand. She had begun writing not fiction, not exactly memoir, something in between. Fragments of stories, whispers, observations too subtle for speech, but too persistent to ignore. She wrote beneath trees, on porch steps, near gravestones and bakery benches. The village had grown used to her presence, even comforted by it. Children waved. Strangers nodded. Mr. Hargrove, ever the skeptic, once left a thermos of coffee on her stoop with no note. One morning, Eleanor passed a group of schoolchildren gathered by the lavender bushes in front of the Weatherford House. They were making flower crowns, chattering, laughing, completely unafraid. She stopped and watched them from a distance. One girl, the same child from before, looked up and called out, "Did the lady in the window go away?" Eleanor smiled. "No, sweet one. She just found her way home." The children nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. She walked on, her notebook tucked under her arm. That night, Eleanor lit a candle by her window. Not for mourning, not even for remembrance, just as a gesture. A small light in a quiet house. She reread the journal entries she'd copied. Lydia's words no longer felt sorrowful. They read like petals pressed into paper. She could feel Lydia's voice between the lines, not just the ache of waiting, but the strength of loving without demand. She had learned something unexpected, that not all hauntings are cries. Some are invitations to listen, to stay, to be still enough to witness what's asking to be seen. As the candle flickered low, Eleanor placed her hand over the journal. Then she opened her notebook and began a new page. At the top, she wrote, "The house no longer sings, but the soil hums. And from that hum, new stories bloom." She paused, tapped her pen against her lip, then wrote beneath it, "I do not carry the past. I walk with it. A breeze stirred the curtain beside her. Not chilly, not unsettling, just present, like a breath. The lavender scent was faint now, barely there, but that felt right. It had been carried far enough. She looked out the window one last time that evening. The Weatherford house stood silent, dark, and dignified. Not a relic, not a ruin, just a house again. And for the first time, Eleanor felt no need to visit. She had walked the path long enough. The garden would take it from here. The village of Millgrave Hollow settled into a rhythm all its own, the seasons turning gently as if keeping time with an ancient melody only it could hear. Eleanor found comfort in the quiet patterns, the rising sun, the whisper of wind through trees, the steady bloom of lavender along her window ledge. She no longer felt the pull of the Weatherford house as urgent, but sometimes she caught herself walking near the gate, now fully restored and painted a soft moss green, without realizing. It was a kindness, she thought, a gentle invitation, not a summons. One afternoon, she met the local historian, Mr. Caldwell, at the market. An older man with spectacles that caught the sunlight and a voice like worn leather. He had been quietly collecting stories about the village for decades. "I hear you've taken an interest in the Weatherford family," he said, peering at her over a basket of fresh herbs. Eleanor nodded. "It's complicated. More than just history." He smiled knowingly. "History is never just facts. It's the stories we choose to hold on to." They sat for a moment beneath the elm tree, the market bustling around them, but the space between them calm. "Did you know," he continued, "that lavender was once believed to protect against sorrow? That planting it was a way to keep grief at bay?" Eleanor thought of Lydia's garden, still blooming against all odds. "It seems fitting." Mr. Caldwell nodded. "Sometimes the stories that last aren't the loudest. They're the ones planted quietly like seeds beneath the soil, waiting for someone to nurture them." Eleanor smiled softly. "I think I'm learning to do that." As the sun dipped low, she looked toward the Weatherford house. The windows glowed faintly, as if lit from within by a hearth fire. She didn't feel watched or haunted. She felt included, part of a story that was still growing, still breathing. And as she walked away, the scent of lavender followed her like a benediction. Not a ghost's sorrow, just a garden's blessing. The village settled into the quiet of early evening, the sky fading from soft pink to deep indigo. Eleanor stood at the edge of the lavender garden, her hands lightly grazing the tall stalks, now heavy with fragrant blossoms. The scent filled the air, warm, gentle, and peaceful, like an old friend's embrace. For months, the Weatherford house had been more than just a forgotten relic. It had become a place of stories, memories, and healing. Eleanor had come to understand that some spirits do not linger to frighten, but to remind us of love's endurance, of promises kept beyond the bounds. She looked up toward the house, its windows glowing softly with candlelight, and felt a quiet gratitude for the journey she had taken. The mist, the music, the lavender, all threads woven into a tapestry of remembrance. Her thoughts drifted back to the woman in the lavender dress, the bride who waited, the soul who never gave up hope. A gentle breeze stirred the garden, carrying the scent of lavender closer, as if offering a final farewell. Eleanor closed her eyes, breathing it in deeply. The day has done all it needs to do. Now only stillness remains. Let your thoughts loosen, like threads unraveling in the dark. What comes next is not to solve or to chase, just a quiet story drifting close. Perhaps it's a voice that remembers you, or a silence that has waited patiently. Let it meet you where you are, and let it lead you gently into rest. She opened her eyes to the soft glow of twilight, feeling the peace settle within her like a calm tide. And as the stars began to shimmer above Millgrave Hollow, the garden bloomed in silence, an eternal promise whispered on the breeze. Not all spirits seek to frighten. Some just wished to be remembered. If their tale lingered with you, let it rest with your breath. Sleep well tonight. And if you hear a whisper in your dreams, maybe it's just the end of the story.